My name is Clara, and I am 26 years old, and on the night of my parents' 25th wedding anniversary, I was standing in the middle of our own family banquet hall, holding a tray of empty champagne flutes, while my mother told a room full of 80 people that I was nothing more than the hired help. I could hear the clinking of silverware stop all at once. I could smell the roasted duck and the heavy scent of lilies my mother had insisted on having placed on every table. I had spent 3 days cooking that food. I had spent 4 years building the catering business that paid for the lilies and the rented crystal and the live string quartet playing in the corner. But at that exact moment, according to my family, I was just a servant who had gotten too comfortable. It started 5 years ago, when my father had a massive stroke on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my 2nd year of culinary school in Berlin. I had fought my way into that program. I had worked 2 minimum wage jobs just to pay for my dorm room and my knives. When the hospital called, I was in the middle of a practical exam making a hollandaise sauce. I dropped my whisk and I was on the next train home. My father was paralyzed on his left side, and he could barely speak. My mother was sitting in the hospital waiting room crying into her phone, but she was not crying about my father. She was crying to my sister Jessica about how hard this was going to be for her social calendar. Jessica was 2 years older than me. She had dropped out of high school at 17 because she said formal education was a trap for ordinary people. She spent her days going to the gym, getting her nails done, and shopping with the allowance my father gave her. She had never worked a single day in the catering business my father built from nothing. When the doctor told us my father would need months of rehabilitation and that the business would suffer without him, my mother looked at me and said, "Clara, you have to come home and run things." I did not even hesitate. I packed my dorm room into 2 suitcases, and I moved back into the house I grew up in. I thought it was temporary. I thought my mother and sister would step up and help. I was wrong. For the first 6 months, I slept on a cot in the office of the banquet hall, because I was there from 5 in the morning until midnight. I learned the accounts. I learned the suppliers. I hired new staff when the old ones quit because they were scared the business was going under. I negotiated contracts with wedding planners. I personally cooked for 12 weddings that summer, while my father was learning to walk again. My mother visited him twice a week for an hour. Jessica visited him once just to ask for money to fix her car. During those 5 years, I rebuilt the business. I took it from the brink of bankruptcy to the most profitable it had ever been. We expanded the kitchen. We bought a second delivery van. I developed a new menu that became famous in the local wedding scene. I paid off all of my father's medical debts using the business accounts. I did all of this while my mother and Jessica lived in the main house, treating me like a ghost. Whenever I came home to shower and change, they would look at me with disgust. My mother started telling relatives that I was obsessed with money and that I had forced my way into the business just to control the family. Jessica started telling people that I was stealing from the company. I never defended myself because I thought the work would speak for itself. I thought that when my father finally recovered enough to see what I had done, he would set the record straight. But my father never fully recovered. His mind was sharp, but his body gave out completely 2 months ago. The funeral was a blur of fake tears and whispered arguments about who was going to inherit what. I did not care about the inheritance. I just wanted to mourn the man who had taught me how to hold a knife and how to balance a ledger. But my mother and Jessica were already plotting. Which brings us back to the 25th wedding anniversary party. My mother had decided to throw a massive celebration at the banquet hall. She told me it was to honor my father's memory. But I knew the truth. She had invited a corporate lawyer from the city. She had printed out fancy menus with my sister's name on them as the new director of operations. The whole night was a stage for my public execution. I was in the kitchen checking on the main course when my mother walked in with Jessica and the lawyer. My mother looked at my apron and my stained shirt, and she smirked. She told me that I needed to go out and serve the appetizers because the waitstaff was behind. I told her that I had already plated the appetizers and that they were on the hotline. Jessica laughed and said that I was acting like I owned the place. My mother then said the words that are still burned into my brain. She said, "Clara, you are the help. You have always been the help. Now put on a serving jacket and do what you are good at." I stood there for a moment. I felt the heat from the ovens on my face. I looked at the lawyer who was avoiding my eyes. I took off my apron. I washed my hands. I put on a black serving jacket, and I went out into the hall. I served the food. I poured the wine. I smiled at the guests while my mother and Jessica sat at the head table drinking expensive wine that I had purchased for the business. An hour into the dinner, my mother stood up and tapped her champagne glass. The room went quiet. She gave a speech about my father. She talked about how much she missed him. She talked about how hard the last few years had been for her. Then she looked directly at me as I was standing by the kitchen doors holding a tray of empty glasses. She said that she was so grateful that her daughter Jessica had been brave enough to step up and take over the family business during this difficult time. She announced that as of tonight, Jessica was the sole owner and operator of the catering company. The room erupted in polite applause. Jessica stood up and took a bow. I saw a few of my employees look at me with confusion. They knew I ran the place. They knew I did all the work, but they stayed quiet. My mother then did something even worse. She waved me over to the head table. I walked over carrying my tray. My mother looked at me and said in front of everyone that she wanted to publicly thank me for my service. She said that even though I was not family material, and even though I had chosen to be just an employee, she was glad I could at least be useful on this special night. Then she handed me a folded piece of paper. She said it was a very generous severance package, since I was being let go effective immediately. I unfolded the paper. It was not a severance package. It was a non-disclosure agreement. They were not firing me with pay. They were firing me with nothing, and telling me I was legally not allowed to tell anyone that I had ever worked there or built the business. My hands started to shake. I looked at Jessica. She was smiling at me with this cold, dead look in her eyes. She whispered just loud enough for me to hear that I should sign it and leave before I embarrassed myself. I could have signed it. I could have walked away. I had enough savings to start over. But as I stood there holding that piece of paper, I thought about my father. I thought about him lying in that hospital bed, unable to move, unable to speak, but squeezing my hand with his good hand while I read him the monthly profit reports. I thought about the look in his eyes when I told him the debt was paid off. He knew what my mother and sister were. He knew they were going to try to take everything the moment he was gone, and he had told me not to worry. He had told me he had fixed it. I put the piece of paper face down on the table. I did not sign it. My mother narrowed her eyes and told me to sign the paper and get out. I reached into the inside pocket of my serving jacket. I pulled out a thick manila envelope. I had carried it with me all night. I had carried it with me every day for the last 3 years, since the day my father handed it to me in his hospital room. My mother asked me what that was. I told her it was the truth. I turned to the corporate lawyer who was sitting next to Jessica, looking very uncomfortable. I asked him if he had actually read the full corporate charter of the business before agreeing to help my mother steal it. He shifted in his chair and said that he had reviewed the standard ownership documents and that the shares were being transferred from my late father to my mother as the surviving spouse. I opened the envelope. I pulled out 3 documents. I handed one to the lawyer. I handed one to my mother. I kept one for myself. I told the lawyer to read the first page out loud. He looked at the document. His face went completely white. He cleared his throat. He read out loud that 6 years ago, before my father's stroke, my father had executed an irrevocable trust. He read that 85% of the shares of the catering company had been placed into this trust, and that the sole beneficiary of the trust was me. The room was completely silent. You could hear the ice melting in the glasses. My mother grabbed the paper out of the lawyer's hand. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper crinkled. She screamed that it was fake. She said I had forged it. I told her to turn to the second page. It was notarized. It was witnessed by 2 of my father's oldest business partners. It was signed by my father in clear handwriting before his illness had taken his motor skills. The lawyer looked at the notary stamp and confirmed it was legitimate. He then read the 3rd clause. This was the part my father had specifically explained to me in the hospital. He had known my mother would try to sell the business or transfer it, so the trust had a poison pill. If anyone attempted to claim ownership of the company through inheritance or transfer without my explicit written consent, the transfer was immediately nullified. Furthermore, my mother and sister were immediately barred from holding any position within the company or profiting from it in any way. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the paper like it was on fire. Jessica started yelling that I was a liar and a thief. I turned to Jessica, and I spoke clearly so everyone in the room could hear me. I told her that for the last 5 years she had lived in a house bought by my labor. She had driven a car paid for by my labor. She had worn clothes and taken vacations funded by the business I had rebuilt from the ashes of my father's illness. I told her that she had never poured a cup of coffee in that kitchen. She had never scrubbed a pot. She had never missed a single night of sleep because the payroll had to be met. I turned back to the lawyer. I told him that as the 85% owner and the executor of my father's trust, I was exercising my right to remove the current management. I fired my mother. I fired my sister. I told them they had until the end of the night to clear their personal belongings out of the house because I was selling it to pay back the money they had stolen from the business accounts over the last 2 months. My mother lunged at me. She tried to grab the documents out of my hand. The lawyer stepped between us. He was no longer on her side. He was a corporate lawyer, and he knew exactly what kind of legal nightmare he had just avoided by not signing off on the fake transfer. He told my mother that if she touched me, he would call the police. Jessica broke down crying. She started begging me. She said she was my sister. She said family was supposed to stick together. I looked at her and I felt nothing. I told her that family does not treat you like a dog. Family does not steal your life and then ask you to sign a paper saying it never happened. I told her that real family shows up when you are drowning and they throw you a rope. They do not stand on the shore charging you for the air you breathe. I picked up the tray of empty glasses. I turned around and I walked back into the kitchen. My head chef was standing there with his mouth open. He had heard everything through the service door. I handed him the tray. I told him to keep the food coming out and to make sure the guests had a good time. I took off the serving jacket. I walked into my office. I closed the door. I sat down at my desk and I finally let myself cry. I cried for my father. I cried because he was gone, and he was the only person in that family who ever saw my worth. I cried because I had spent 5 years of my youth fighting for people who actively hated me just because I existed. But mostly I cried out of relief. The heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations and their abuse was finally gone. I did not have to prove myself to them anymore. The documents in my jacket proved everything I needed to know. I learned something very important that night. Toxic families will bleed you dry and then demand a thank you for the privilege. They will take your sacrifices and twist them into proof of your worthlessness. They will stand in a room full of people and call you the help just to make themselves feel tall. But the truth does not need a microphone. The truth just needs a piece of paper and the right moment. You do not have to scream to be heard. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding all the power. I walked out of that office an hour later. The party was winding down. My mother and Jessica had already left in a hurry. The guests were whispering, but nobody dared say a word to me. I locked the front doors of the banquet hall. I turned off the lights. I got in my car and I drove to a hotel. I did not go back to that house. I never went back. The next morning, I changed the locks on the business. I changed the bank accounts. I hired a new accountant. I moved on with my life, and I left them with exactly what they deserved: nothing. If you have a story like this, leave it in the comments, and subscribe for more stories about toxic families and the people who finally fought back. I will see you next time.